Imagine being able to slay a massive 750-pound predator with nothing but a simple buck knife. Sounds like something straight out of a Hollywood movie, doesn't it? Well, the following true story is about a man who not just dared to challenge one of the world's most feared animals in an unprecedented encounter, but one who would, against all odds, turn the tables on it in the most unexpected of ways. This is the legendary story of Gene Moe's nearly fatal encounter with the Kodiak bear. Kodiak Island is situated along the south coast of Alaska and is renowned for its picturesque rivers and glistening bays. It's also well known for its profuse population of salmon that draws anglers from far and wide. The island boasts a verdant mountainous forest, which is also home to the largest terrestrial carnivore on Earth, the Kodiak bear. These bears are renowned for their diet of salmon, which enables them to attain extraordinary sizes of up to 1,500 pounds. However, the year 1999 was vastly dissimilar in comparison to previous years. The berry crop was woefully inadequate, as a severe preceding winter had resulted in the untimely demise of an estimated 1/3 of the deer population. Additionally, there was a scarcity of Pacific salmon that made their way upstream to spawn, perish, and provide the vital fat-building nutrition for these bears. This would consequently leave most of them in a state of starvation. It's the autumnal cusp of November 1st, 1999. 69-year-old Gene Moe and his intrepid hunting cohort set out on a grand expedition to Afognak Island, a verdant wooded paradise situated above 5 kilometers northwest of the beautiful village of Kodiak. Shortly after setting up camp, the quartet, consisting of Gene, his son Carl, and 2 of Gene's trusty employees from his concrete contracting business, Tom Frolick and Steve Fitzpatrick, valiantly navigate their vessel across the tumultuous straits, venturing towards the lower extremities of nearby Raspberry Island. The men were in search of the elusive Sitka black-tailed deer. The quartet embarked on their journey in the early hours of the day, with Gene devising a strategy to divide the groups into 2 teams. Carl and Tom were to proceed independently during the search, while Gene paired himself with Steve and planned to strategically position them atop a jagged cliff approximately 200 yards away. Gene's plan was to position Steve on a ridge and move out about 200 yards, then circle back and try to lure deer toward him. And let's say Gene got a chance for a buck, he would take it, and of course, vice versa. So to make it clear, the pair was to split up and pursue the deer individually in 2 different vicinities ranging from about 200 yards apart. And the protocol called for the partners to be vigilant for the sound of a gunshot, as well as listen for the call of an owl, which would be an indication for Steve to join Gene and provide support during the field dressing. As the men get in position as per protocol, the weather suddenly takes a turn for the worse. Gene shouts to Steve through the thunderous rainy weather, asking him if he could still hear him with his cap's flaps covering his ears. Steve shouts back in agreement, and so the stage was set and the men move forward with the hunt. Not long afterward, Steve's owl call would fail to reach Gene through the unfavorable weather conditions, and to top it off, he would fail to discharge around on time when an elusive black-tailed deer finally did present itself. It's about 1 p.m., and just as the heavy rainfall subsides, Gene, determined to capture his trophy deer, continues to venture forward into the shadowy depths of the forest. As he quietly traverses the wood and scans for movement, he abruptly notices some large and very apparent scratch marks along some tree bark. Given his 30 years of hunting experience in these woods, Gene not only knew very well that these marks belonged to none other than a Kodiak bear, but he was also aware of the fact that this was a bear's way of marking its territory and a clear warning sign that visitors are not welcome. Well aware that there's always challenges as such when hunting game in these areas, Gene's decades of experience instill in him the confidence to continue the hunt for the elusive blacktail. And so, he cautiously continues on through the forest, using its natural cover and topography to shroud his presence. And despite a clear tension in the air stemming from the looming presence of a dangerous apex predator, the situation, despite the danger it presented, would yet hold a certain allure for the experienced outdoorsman, as the thrill of the situation sends adrenaline rushing through his veins, sharpening his senses as he hunted. Despite deeply searching the thick and verdant foliage of the woods, Gene begins getting slightly frustrated at this point as no sign of a blacktail or a call from Steve present themselves. It wasn't until approximately 2 p.m. that Gene's eyes suddenly light up when he finally spots an elusive black-tailed deer amidst some thicket in the distance. Gene's discerning eye peers through his rifle's scope with unwavering focus and soon come to rest upon the animal's sleek form through an apparent gap in the thicket, conveniently allowing him enough room for a lethal shot. Its fur set alight with the rays of the sun, which began to peer through the clearing clouds, setting its eyes aglow as they pierced them. The experienced hunter takes a moment to marvel at the spectacle before him, before taking position behind a tall spruce tree, where he would wait for approximately 20 minutes with his gaze locked on his trophy. Deeming the time ripe for the kill, Gene then locks his rifle's sight on the very same spot that he'd been eyeing this whole time, and fires a perfectly placed shot at the deer, dropping her almost instantaneously. After multiple failed owl calls, Gene inevitably decides to undertake the task of skinning the animal alone, considering that the daylight would be immensely favorable in not just efficiently, but safely transporting the carcass back to their camp in Afognak. Gene's fateful decision to go against the very same protocol he had prior established with Steve by traversing into deeper wood unexpectedly leads him full circle and back into the very same bear territory from which he had started. With danger that once seemed distant suddenly looming closer than ever, an unsuspecting Gene does something completely out of character and carelessly leans his rifle against a rock and thereby commences to full-out butcher his hard-won kill by the stream. And with the scent of fresh blood rising into the air, this suddenly attracts the attention of a massive Kodiak bear who was prowling some nearby thicket in search of its next meal. As the bear goes into sensory overload, the aforementioned scent of blood begins drawing it towards the deer's carcass like a fly to carrion. And as Gene continues to hack away at the deer's remains, he's blissfully unaware of the impending terror that now lurked just meters away. According to research conducted by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, it's worth noting that bears possess an olfactory acumen that is 2,100 times more accurate than our comparative feeble human senses. In other words, they have a heck of a nose, and they're capable of discerning even the faintest of scents from miles away. And they would stop at nothing, not even stealing food directly from our grasps, to satiate their seemingly never-ending hunger. As the massive Kodiak stealthily approaches Gene's immediate surroundings, it would suddenly announce its presence with a deafening roar, instantly sending shivers down Gene's spine. And like a scene straight out of a horror movie, the massive Kodiak sow then gets on her hind legs and rises high above the ground, her lifeless eyes locked on Gene as she towered over him, with pools of saliva proceeding to drip from her jaws, the shadow of her massive form engulfing him in the darkness as her body language began displaying hints that she was getting ready to strike. Gene snaps out of his frozen state and, knowing that time was of the essence, begins to frantically search for his rifle, only to realize with despair that it lay a hopeless 20 meters away, with all remaining in his grasp being the very same buck knife with which he had initially sliced his way into this predicament. With the clock ticking down to a seemingly inevitable demise, Gene's only hope for survival lay in the small knife clutched tightly in his trembling grip, and with the ravenous Kodiak before him, frothed at the mouth with a hunger so fierce that it seemed almost otherworldly, Gene knew at this point that one false move could spell the end of him. He then aims his blade at the center of the beast's head and tries to strike it in the middle of the forehead, but would once again freeze in horror when he realizes that he's basically attempting to puncture tempered steel. The now enraged Kodiak lunges at him and proceeds to viciously maul him. Gene screams in agony as the massive Kodiak continues to bite down on his torso, tearing chunks of flesh off of it, as well as inflicting severe lacerations throughout. As he feels the immense force of the Kodiak's massive jaws latch onto his arm and attempt to separate it from his body, a determined Gene then reaches for one of the bear's eyes, and in a last-ditch effort to save his life, he jams his finger in as deep as he could get it and desperately gouges at one of the bear's eyes, causing her to release him from her vice grip. But the persistent Kodiak seemed even more enraged by this, and it becomes apparent to Gene, judging by her body language, that she's getting ready to deal some fatal damage and close in for the kill. Having watched bears for years, Gene was aware that, like humans, most bears exhibit a preference for utilizing their right paw when striking, and with the Kodiak before him standing upright on its hind legs, he was certain that her stance was a clear indication that she was preparing to deliver a powerful strike. And just as he'd predicted, the Kodiak then swings at him with her right paw, which is when Gene manages to instinctively dodge the blow, jerking his head back and evading what he described as a right hook. Despite this impressive feat, the bear nevertheless manages to deal some damage at least by splitting Gene's ear open with one of her claws, resulting in it hanging loosely by a thread. The unsuccessful attempt only serves to increase the now frustrated Kodiak's desire for his demise, as she now lets out a snarl, drops to all fours from her hind legs, and proceeds to charge Gene once again, lunging at him and making impact with a powerful crushing blow, and knocking him on his back. Gene feels the Kodiak's immense weight on top of him, but somehow still summons the will to avoid the unbearable pain, and with his sturdy hunting boots, kicks the 750-pound bear away and manages to regain his footing. Perceiving that her ferocity was beginning to wane at this point, Gene, who was physically limited due to his now severe injuries, conjures up yet another strategy to outsmart the sow's powerful paw. He then strategically positions himself between him and the bear, and just as she tried to strike his head, he makes a quick move, causing her paw to miss it, but the claws instead manage to this time pierce his leg above the knee, further exacerbating the pain from his rising number of severe injuries. Despite the excruciating agony that he was in, a determined Gene once again seizes yet another opportunity, and with his left arm draped over her neck, proceeds to repeatedly plunge his knife into the soft tissue near her jaw. The Kodiak, in an attempt to thwart Gene's attacks, lifts him off the ground with a single paw, but a persistent Gene would continue stabbing her despite this, even whilst in the air, which is when finally, the massive Kodiak abruptly drops him and pushes him away using both her front paws. Sensing that this was the time to deal potentially lethal damage, Gene then unleashes one more powerful stab near her jaws, which this time caused blood to begin gushing from it profusely. The bear is now not just clearly fatigued, but severely injured, and decides to withdraw from the fray at this point, and thereby circles out beyond the arena of trampled snow. Recognizing that the tide of the battle has now shifted in his favor, a confident Gene, knowing just how close he was to victory, shouts a challenge to his ursine opponent. "Come on, God is on my side." The mighty bear obliges, but this time her charge was not at all swift in comparison to her previous ones, and Gene, who was himself severely wounded with loose skin and flesh hanging from his arm and claw gashes on his shoulder, not to mention a painfully injured right leg, at this point draws back his left fist, and just as the bear lunges towards him, delivers a crushing punch to her head just underneath her eye. The force of the impact in conjunction with the bear's own momentum was so powerful that Gene's arm and hand go numb, causing him to lose sensation in his knuckles upon impact. And finally, the sow's head twitches momentarily, which is when she falls face first to the ground, ending a battle between man and bear like no other. Despite his epic and unprecedented triumph, Gene would sustain severe injuries and lose a copious amount of blood. To add to his struggles, after he'd kill the bear, he'd still have to traverse the treacherous woods for about a mile and a half, all whilst grappling with consciousness and mobility. He would abandon his rifle to conserve his energy and muster the strength to hike down the mountain to the beach, where to his good fortune, he'd be located by his partners, who would thereby take him to a cabin where they would call for a rescue copter. Gene's recovery was long and arduous, requiring a month of rehabilitation, skin grafts, and almost 500 stitches. He would ultimately make a full recovery and even retain the bear's pelt as a trophy, one that he shows off till this very day, and understandably so, as it's not every day that a human can say that they fought and defeated a bear, especially without a gun. If this episode piqued your interest, then the previous episode about a man-eating crocodile named Osama, who was responsible for having killed and consumed 83 people in Uganda during a 14-year rampage, is sure to do the same. You can find it on the end screen of this video.